We are wrapping up a series today on the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, the Old Testament book about love and marriage and romance. There's an old saying that talking about love is like dancing about architecture. The idea there being that the medium is insufficient for the message, right? But Lord knows we've tried, and you've watched me cha-cha through cathedrals up here, trying to put language around the mysteries of love. And we've stumbled forward together, and I think it's good. You need architecture. You need a building to give you shelter from the cold, right? And we need love to give us shelter in a dangerous world. And we may not all have a romantic love, but we need to know what it is to love and be loved. And we've been looking at not just my words, but at the words of God about what love is like. And we are just minutes away, family, from the final words of the greatest book on love that you'll ever read. And if you've been with us through this series, it's been a pretty wild ride. I'm sure many of you will never look at fawns or palm trees the same way again. But today we're at the climax of the story, the pinnacle of it. I mean, if you remember last week, we sort of had a tight shot on this couple as we watched them dance together into their journey of cultivating their love. And now something interesting is going to happen in this collection of poems about love. We're going to watch the lens pull out. And we're going to speak not so particularly about their love, but about the nature of love itself. And what's fascinating about today is we're going to see, I would say, 7 truths about the nature of love. And then at the end of that, there's a postscript about some brothers who are asking the question, what do we do when our little sister wants to start dating? And I know some of you, that's going to be the section you're most interested in. All right, but let's look at first, what is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more. All right, verse 5 says, who is that coming up from the wilderness leaning on her beloved? So this is great. If you remember from a couple weeks ago, there was a moment where the question was asked, who is this coming up out of the wilderness like a column of smoke? And it was an image of their wedding day, that as Solomon is arriving to take his bride, she sees a picture of God's pursuit of his people Israel. That he came to get them in Egypt, draw them into the wilderness. He led them like a column of smoke to the land of promise. And so she saw him on that wedding day. Who is this coming up like a column of smoke? It was the arrival of her beloved to unite with her. But if you remember in that poem in the past, there was a ceremonial nature to it. It was ornate and it had the sense of formality. And there was also a tension to it that we watched in their courtship and their romance. They would restrain their passions as they would evaluate, is this the right person to set all my affection upon? And so you felt the tension of that restraint as they fulfilled all righteousness in the consummating of their marriage vows. And then we watched that tension release as they learned what it is to dance in love together on their wedding night. But now as we arrive at the end of the book, we see they're married and they're emerging together from the wilderness. If you remember last time, they had escaped the city and went on a little weekend retreat out into the countryside to cultivate their love together. And now we see them arriving again from over the distance. But as their caravan approaches, the scene changes. It's not ornate and formal, it's tender. That as they arrive, she's leaning on him. Her head is resting on her beloved. It's a picture of intimacy and affection, that she's his and he's hers. And as they ride back to the city, she begins to speak of love. And we get our first point in this first verse. She says in verse 5, under the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother was in labor with you. There she who bore you was in labor. Now the idea there is not that he was sleeping and she woke him up like, hey! So she's not saying like, remember that time you were asleep and I woke you up? The idea there is I awakened you to love. I aroused your romantic and your sexual life. The apple tree was a sensual image in ancient poetry. And what she's saying there is your mother brought you to life, and then at a different time, and I awakened you to a new romantic life. It's like the Garden of Eden. If you recall, God created Adam and then put Adam to work. And Adam began to cultivate and work and name animals. And then do you remember at a certain point, God put Adam to sleep. And then God pulled a rib out, created that woman from his side, and then Adam was awoken again, but awoken to this intimate relationship of love. She's grabbing some of this imagery that there was a time that you came to life and there was this other time where you were awakened to love. I had a coworker, my first ministry I worked in. She would tell me and this other young man in ministry, she said, I'm praying for you that as you pursue ministry, you would be like Adam, just doing the work in the garden. And then God in his right timing would knock you out and then wake you up and you would see your beloved. She said, I'm just praying that you would know when the time comes. And here she says, do you remember that moment came when you awoke and I was there? I awakened you. And yet she's talking about this language of you came alive from your mom, that we're in this place where she was in labor with you, and now you're awakened to me. She's tying these ideas together of love and life, that there's an intimate connection between love and life. It's a continuation of life. That's the first thing about real love. It's life-giving. Very directly, your parents' love brought you to life. It's going to be a fun thing to tell my kids over and over again, right? You know, it's because your mama and I's love that you were, stop, Dad, but it's coming. But how brilliant is that? That God designed it in such a way that the continuation of the species isn't some horrific act, but two people find each other, and then in their greatest expression of love to each other, they unite not just their minds and wills and hearts and interests, but their bodies, and that union of love creates life. That's brilliant. And I know that's so obvious, it sounds silly to say it, but it's one of those things that it's obvious to say, but it's marvelous when you experience it. That when you get married to somebody, and I remember with Donna, I'm like, I love this woman, and she loves me, and we've bound our lives together, and our life created a person who's part us and looks a bit like her and a bit like me, that love creates life. I remember one day just watching our little daughter just banging away on a piano, and I'm like, love made you. Love makes life. This is so crazy, it's so beautiful, but in a myriad of ways, love is life-giving, and that's the idea she's pulling up here. It's meant to all be bound together, and we saw it in the past in this poem and in Proverbs that love is meant to be enjoyed sexually for fun. It's not just for procreation, and yet it's intimately bound with procreation, that all these gifts are meant to come together, that I bind myself with you. We enjoy one another, and that enjoyment creates life. It's good, all bound up together. And then in verse 6, she begins to speak to her lover with what I would say is probably some of the most powerful imagery in the book. She says in verse 6, set me as a seal upon your heart. Set me as a seal upon your arm. A seal back then was made of maybe wood or stone. It had an image carved into it that represented you. It was an obvious image. Judah in the book of Genesis, his seal was instantly recognized as his. That's your seal. That marking signifies you. It was something that you would use, that you could press into clay or press into wax, and it was to show that that thing belongs to me. When I stamp my image on it, it's done. It belongs to me. Kings would do it to verify the authenticity of documents. I bind myself to it. Some of you were in college when you had shared refrigerators. You would write your name on your milk, set your mark upon it. This is my milk, holy unto me, no other lips may touch it, right? The idea of a seal is I am unapologetically identified with this thing. And that's what she says love is. She says, I want you to set me like a seal upon your heart, that there's no question that you're mine and I'm yours, that we belong to each other. Set me as a seal upon your arm, that the world may see it, that we belong to each other, that love, this is your second point, is a covenant. By its very nature, it desires to be bonded together. That's what love does. Its affections say, set me apart in your heart, that I belong to you. Set me apart as yours. Set me on your arm. Let the whole world know we belong to each other. Love, romantically, demands fidelity. Even now in America, as surveys are conducted, monogamy is the dominant script of our country. There's such a vulnerability to sex. Over and over again, people fumble with the wording, but they say, I want to experience complete vulnerability and the complete safety of knowing you're bound together with me. That's our desire, even if we don't always live into it. That love demands fidelity. She's saying, I want you to let the world know I own you and you own me. There's this radical self-donation. We belong to one another. Love speaks like this. There's an old poem from the late 90s that says, any other day I would call and you would say, baby, how's your day? But today it ain't the same. Every other word is yeah, okay. Could it be that you are at the crib with another lady? If you took it there, first of all, let me say, I am not the one to sit around and be played. So prove yourself to me. I am the girl that you claim. Why don't you say the things that you said to me yesterday? Say my name, say my name. If no one is around you, say, baby, I love you, if you ain't running game. Say my name, say my name. You acting kind of shady, ain't calling me baby. Why the sudden change? She's not wrong to want fidelity. Love is like that, is it not? Love demands, set me as a seal that I belong to you, you belong to me. You've maybe heard it said, it's the difference between a covenant and a contract. A covenant says, I am bound to you for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. Contracts say, I am here to the degree that you provide a service in a way that I find acceptable. This is how you relate to your cell phone carrier. I don't set T-Mobile as a seal upon my arm. Enough that I can't get reception in the right places, I'm like, you're done, right? But covenants don't work that way. I don't say, I'll sign a contract with you and here are the needs you're supposed to meet, and if you don't meet them the way I like in the sufficient amount of time, I'm out. Contracts are like that. Love's not meant to be that way. People in dating say they love like this, but dating is different than marriage as we're talking about marital love, because a dating relationship, even if it feels intense, can be dissolved over lunch on any day. Right? Cohabitation is the declaration, I might want you, but it leaves the back door open. And survey after survey says, we feel the anxiety of its impermanence when you live in that space. You're not meant to be that way. I evaluate, I hold the tension of distance until I'm sure, do I trust you? Do I know you? Not just are you physically attracted, but do I trust your heart? And do we believe God has forged us together to walk as a lifetime? And when we've evaluated that in the safety of community, then we commit in a covenant until death do us part. Love is meant to speak that way. Love says, burn the boats, I'm not leaving. Throw the bridge into the moat. This castle is mine and I defend it until death. Love talks like that. That's the kind of love that scares us, but we desperately want. It's covenant. I will not let you go, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Love talks like that. And notice the motive of it. For love is as strong as death. Death is an irresistible force. It's a certain reality. And she's saying love is as strong as death. It's as elemental as death. That's number 3. Love is permanent. Real love stays and is unstoppable. In the ancient Near East, they were terrified of Mot, the god of death. He was unstoppable. He comes for us all. He's inescapable. You can't fight him. And here she says, but love is as strong as death. Love can stand off against death. Love will stand up boldly to death. Real love will step in front of a bullet. A mother's real love will dive upon a baby to save it from harm. That's what love does. A man will take any job, no matter what indignity, to provide for his family. He will sacrifice it all. In that great book, The Gates of Fire, about the Spartans at Thermopylae, they were asked, why would these 300 men sell their lives in battle against the Persians knowing they would die? And the motivation the book posits is they were willing to sell their bodies and die gruesome deaths because of love. Love for their wives and love for their children. Love will face off against death. That's what Jesus did in the garden. As he faced the cross and sweat drops of blood, wanting to get out of what was coming. What kept him there? The glory of his Father, the love of his Father, and because the Father so loved the world that he gave his Son. Love will face off against death. I remember sitting with a friend once. It was one of the most powerful, emotional moments in my young life as a 20-something. A couple guys, we were getting to know each other, talking, and it came to family of origin stories, and we're talking about our families. And one of them, his mother had remarried, and she had gotten deathly ill. And he said, man, I just didn't like my stepdad. I didn't like this whole scenario. I didn't like my mom being with this guy, and yet here my mom's health was fading. And she's in the hospital, and I'm in the waiting room, and it's long hours, and it's tedious, and it's uncertain, and crazy making. And he said, we were sitting there, and I looked at this man she had married at one point, and he said, I looked at her, and I said, why don't you just leave? Really, man? This is our family's problem. Why don't you just leave? And he said, I'll never forget my stepfather, my wife's husband looked in my eyes and he said, because when I told your mother in sickness and in health, I meant it. And he said, something changed in my heart that day, and I respected that man and loved that man ever since. He said, because I saw him. He really loved my mom. I saw it when death was at our door. Love stands up and says, I won't back down. That's what love's like. You let go of your bride the day Christ lets go of us. And he says, I will never let anyone snatch my people out of my hand. And that's the way love talks. Love is as strong as death. There's a permanence to it. And it's as jealous, its jealousy is as fierce as the grave. When the grave grabs you, it doesn't let go, right? No matter what Halloween suggests. The grave doesn't share. Okay, you're going to go to the grave, but if you need to run some errands, we'll let you out every Wednesday. No, that's not how it works. And love's like that. Love doesn't share. Jealousy here means a single-minded devotion to something. This is point number 4, that love is exclusive. This kind of love is exclusive. And you hear people say this. I remember hearing Oprah say it once. She said, I heard someone preach that God is jealous, and it precipitated her leaving this church because she said it just sounded so petty and so sad to say that God is jealous, like God is insecure. And the tragedy of that is it's a complete misunderstanding of what this is saying. And so the most important question when you talk about theology is when you say that word, what do you mean? And when this text is talking about jealousy, it's not saying that God is neurotic or paranoid. It's not like that. Exclusivity is not a corrupt or oppressive thing. It is wrong for a lover to be indifferent about the presence of rivals. And in the Bible, jealousy is only permitted in 2 relationships. The divine human relationship in Exodus 20. God says, I'm the only God that's out there. So I'm a jealous God. Why? Because if you try to have a bunch of gods, if you try to share that, you dilute me with liars who will hurt you, which is the story of the whole Old Testament. He's like, so I don't want other rivals in this relationship. I am your God, you are my people. Don't bring these other idols into this. Right? And it's permitted in a marriage relationship that we are not meant to share this bed with others. There's an exclusivity to it. Now, jealousy in friendship, not healthy. Friendship's a different kind of love. Friendship love expands with the addition of the other. So if you have a friend that jealously holds on to you, there's something unhealthy about that. Friends delight in the presence of other friends. It's a different kind of love. But a romantic covenant love like this is exclusive in its nature. It's not wrong for a wife to not want her man to entertain other lovers on the side. It's not wrong. So she's meant to be jealous in that way, not in a paranoid, emotional way, but in a covenantal way. Yeah, when we bind ourselves to each other, the 2 become 1. That's how it's meant to be, right? Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flames of the Lord. She says love like that, it has she calls the imagery of the sword that the angel used in Genesis to bar the garden, that there's a holiness to love. That's number 5. That there's a danger to its strength. If you commit to a friend and y'all quit being friends, that's a bummer. If you marry someone and that marriage breaks apart, it costs you half. That marriage is a holy institution, meaning that it is something God ordained, and Jesus said it. What God joined together, let no man put asunder. Now, when I say this, some of you go like, man, this bar is so high, this is intimidating. Yes, That's why you don't rush into marriage. That's why Jerry Maguire stressed me out so bad when you watch him on his wedding day and he's like uncertain. You're like, bro, get out of there until you're ready. And then they circle around and get lucky afterwards. I don't know. But anyway, the idea is that you don't rush in, you evaluate. This institution of marriage is holy. God has designed it to be a picture of his love for us. And he said, I give everything for you and bind myself to you and will never let you go. And so when we enter into that, we're meant to image that to the world, saying, I will love this person, I give all for them, and I will never let them go. That's how we're supposed to show the world the love of God in the way we love each other. There's a holiness to it. And 1 Corinthians 13 says, love never fails. It's what we want from God. The nation of Israel in the Old Testament, in David, you hear it so much in the Psalms. Whenever he messed up, did something dumb, made a mistake, ruined his life, he would get to points where he realized, I can't earn my way back into God's good graces. I can't earn my way back to a stable place. But the thing that turns all his lament into worship is over and over again the word hesed in Hebrew, which we translate in English, steadfast love, or loyal love. It was God's covenant love with his people. I've made a mess. I've ruined my life. I can't fix it. I can't undo the damage. The only hope I have is that I have a love that will not let me go. And it pulls me out of the pit and sets my feet on a solid rock, makes my footsteps firm, and puts a new song in my life, in my mouth, that I praise a God like that. That's why we sing in here. We sing because of hesed, a steadfast love that will not let us go. There's a holiness to this kind of love. And marriage is meant to picture that it will never fail. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. Not famine or sword. That's what Paul said. Like, what can separate you from God's love? Your mistakes, your failures, your shortcomings? Is God always evaluating and going like, you're out. Okay, you're back in. Okay, no, you're out. God doesn't do that. Shun, unshun. He's not like that. He says, I love you and I'm bound to you. And the way we love each other is supposed to be the same. There is a shallow version in the culture today of what marriage is and what love is. And the Bible says no. What we are participating in by God's design is something far more holy and powerful than that. And it's scary, and you want to be cautious. You want to step into it with reverence. But when you do, it's powerful. And it's the power that many of us, you long for in your heart. That kind of permanence and self-donation. Verse 7, many waters cannot quench love. Neither can floods drown it. That's number 6, love endures. The great fear in the ancient world was water, because you get out in the open seas and you're very fragile out there. And so they realized water is a terrifying thing. You see it a lot in the ancient Near East myths, that you see the gods have to fight the water demon, the uncertainty of water. Many of you felt that. I don't like swimming in the ocean because you go, I'm at a disadvantage to all manner of creatures that want to eat me. So they want to eat me, and they have superior tactical advantage. Why would I put myself in that position? No. I want to get a tactical advantage of the ground and a weapon sufficient to stop their threats. But all through the ancient Near East, Baal versus Yam, Marduk versus Tiamat, the great terror of the deep. And here it says, but when many waters come at love, they can't put it out. Real love endures. Real love crushes death. It's more intense than fire, and it cannot be overcome by the forces of the deep, right? This is Princess Bride, if you ever watched that movie. Love endures the fire swamp and the rodents of unusual size and torture and even being mostly dead. What gets the prince out of being mostly dead? True love, right? True love will endure. It will endure anything for the sake of the beloved, right? That's the kind of love you want. Love that will endure even when it's not feeling it, but saying, but I know the water may be not bubbling up from the well right now, but I will dig deeper because there's water deeper and we can fill this well again. That's what true love does. It endures and it stays. And love is pure. It says if a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, he would be utterly despised. Love is so strong and love is so pure, it's insulted by money. Think about that for a minute. Think about what things men do for money. I mean, just think about the stuff you will go through. Think about the terrible, devious things human beings will do to accrue wealth. Think about the lengths we will go, the hours we will work, the rising and grinding we will do for money. And then if you take that money and try to buy love, love is insulted by it. Love is stronger than your drive for money. Love is stronger than our drive for resources. There's a purity to love that it cannot be purchased. It's insulted by the thought of it. It always hopes, always perseveres, never fails. This is what love is like. This is what you're meant to wait for. This is what you're meant to evaluate in dating. Is this the kind of person I'm willing to commit to like that? This is why dating's a serious thing. And date number one, all you have to decide is should there be a date number two. So don't load all this on date number one. Do I love you with the fierce intensity of 1,000 suns? Like, easy. Find out what their interests are and their hobbies. But as the weeks and months go by, I hold back the tension of physical love to evaluate the emotional love, and I evaluate the character. Can I trust you? Do you trust me? Because what we're talking about here is holy and serious. And as we contemplate the entrance into it, we get trusted counsel around us saying, do you think this person is worthy of my trust? No one can hurt you like your spouse. They know everything about you. Their words can be so damaging. So you be careful. Sure, he's hot, but does he have character? Sure, she's cute, but will she stay even when I'm not producing my best? And you watch and you wait and you evaluate, and then you stand at the edge and you go, this is a holy covenant. Are we willing to get on a stage and declare the name of the Trinity? I promise to love you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Will you speak like that? I tell couples that. I don't do that many weddings, but when I do, I tell them that. Look, traditions have value to the degree that they're valuable to you. Like the Puritans didn't wear white wedding dresses. They wore bright colored ones. They didn't get married in churches. They got married in homes. A lot of us wear white dresses. And I said, the traditions can change. You want to pour sand into a bottle, or you want to light different candles. You want to do different sort of dances and incantations. I don't care. I said, but let me tell you what matters. You're going to stand there in front of God and everybody and invoke the name of the Trinity and say, I promise to love you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You don't trip into that to see how it goes. You evaluate, you take it seriously, and then when you step across that line, it's scary and it's thrilling because you go, this person donated all to me, and I gave all to them. And that forging of those two metals makes something so strong and beautiful and a picture to the world of what love is like. That's what you wait for. That's what you fight for. That's the beauty the world needs to see. There's so many shallow, tinkling, silly things right now that are being called love. The world needs to see something else. It needs to see a love like this. Now, all this talk of love prompts a question from some dudes in the audience. Maybe it's a flashback of her brothers. And so in verse 8, the others speak. And they say, we have a little sister, and she has no breasts. Now, listen. Their point is she's young. But obviously, her sexuality is in view. They're like, we have a sister. She has no breasts. What shall we do for our sister on the day when she's spoken for? They feel some level of responsibility over her romantic and sexual life. Now, if this is a flashback to her brothers, if you noticed earlier in the text, her dad's never mentioned. She talks about moms a lot. She talks about her brothers. Maybe she didn't have a dad around. And so these brothers who know guys, and no guys can act chivalrous out here and talk very differently in the locker room. When they watch their little sister grow up, they see not that I don't trust you, it's I don't trust them. And yet they don't want to do a macho chivalrous, well, every guy's going to get bounced off my chest. They're going like, no, there's going to be a day she's called for. How do we do this? How do we honor and protect her as she buds and grows? And how do we see that this happens in a good way, that her affections land on the right kind of person? What are we supposed to do on the day when she's spoken for? And it's not a macho goofiness. There seems to be a sincerity of going, there is a day we want her to be spoken for. What do we do here? How do we help prepare her for her future marriage? How do we as a community support young women as they grow? The answer is it depends. That's what the text says. Verse 9. If she's a wall, we will build on her battlements of silver. If she is a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar. What does that mean? It's talking about the sexuality of this unmarried woman. Is she a wall? Walls are enclosures. They close things off. You don't enter through a wall. If she's wallish, that means she is chaste. And they say, if that's her, then we will adorn her with battlements of silver. It's protective language, but a battlement of silver is decorative. You don't go to war with a shield made of silver. What her brothers are saying is, if she has a virtue and a character and won't settle for some guy that lacks character, then we'll take up a ceremonial position. And we will be there to protect her, but it will be battlements of silver because we know she's safe, she's making good decisions. Basically what they're saying is, we'll honor her life choices. For me, I remember in college having my sophomore and junior year, having a lot of friends that were young women, and they all had horror stories of going on a date with a guy and figuring out somewhere in the night that this man wasn't safe. And the thought of that, them in a car, or them alone at a place, and then realizing this isn't a safe person. He's not using his strength for good. His power is not bound by virtue. And then I saw my little sister coming to college and got terrified and was like, how do I not let that happen? And I remember showing up at lunch and some guys talking about Ben's little sister showing up at college. And one of them started joking about, I'm going to go hit on your sister as soon as she gets here. I'm going to date her. And I didn't trust this guy. So I told him, I'll kill you. And they all thought it was like, like bravado thing, like my ego. And I'm like, no, like I've heard the way you talk about women. I will take your life. It's worth the time. I'll pay it. But I got scared, and I met some other women that I watched say no to guys. They wanted to get married, but if a guy wasn't trustworthy, they wouldn't go on a date with him. And I started to ask them, how did you build that fortitude? How did you do that? And I was trying to figure out as a brother, like, how do I step in and what do I do? And then I watched my sister make good choices. I watched her not jump at every invitation, and I watched her be wise in how she handled her body and affections and her love and her heart. And I was like, oh, thank God, she's a wall. And all I got to do is stand there with a shield of silver, right? And say hi to everybody at the reception because she's going to make good choices. But then he says if she's a door, and I think that's a fairly obvious image, doors are open and provide access. So he's saying if she is permissive or promiscuous in her relationships, if she doesn't guard her body and her heart and cherish it as valuable, then we'll board up the door. They're like, to the degree we can, we're going to try to stop her entering into these experiences that will be damaging. We don't want her to go through what Gomer did in the book of Hosea, of I will take my affections to those not worthy of them and end up losing more than I gain. Elizabeth Elliot wrote this in Passion and Purity, a book from the 80s. She said her boyfriend, later husband, accused her of having a, quote, militant morality. That's what he called her, which if you ever read Elizabeth Elliot, militant is a fairly accurate term for her, her articulation of her spiritual life. But she wrote this to her, I believe her niece. She said, what looked to Jim, her later husband, like militant morality was partly the knowledge that deep in a woman, she holds the key to the situation where a man's passions are involved. He will be as much of a gentleman as she requires, and when the chips are down, probably no more, even if he has strict standards of his own. He will measure her reserve, always testing the limits, probing. Keep your distance, I say to women. Recognize the fundamental anomaly of human nature, that what we prize we cannot easily get. We take for granted, even come to despise, that which costs us no effort. Now, let me be clear on this. The sexual restraint of men is not a woman's responsibility, right? Men are meant to be bound by virtue, right? Out of their fear of God. That's how it's supposed to be. And let me say this too. You'll hear statements today about like, well, all men are pigs or all men are whatever. And let me just dispel something. All through this series, I've said some hard things to men and will continue to. But let me be clear on something. I don't buy into the lie that the good men are gone or there's no good men. I know a lot of them, and they're in this room. Lion-faced men, good men, strong men that use that strength and virtue because they're humble and honor God. I sit in Bible studies with them, in team leader meetings with them. There are good men here. Just as damaged and confused and mixed up as many of you by the chaos of the sexual revolution, but good men. So it may be harder to meet and marry today than in any generation in recorded history. But don't let that breed a cynicism that the good men are gone. There are many here. We're stumbling forward together. Amen? But it's interesting. Mark Regnerus, who does studies on young people and love and sex and romance, says, in normal, healthy relationships, usually the determiner of how frequent sex is and when it debuts in a relationship is the woman. Unless the guy is straight dangerous, it's usually her that gets to decide the pace. And so, again, that doesn't make his sexuality your responsibility. It just says, statistically speaking, you tend to determine the debut and the pace. And here, as the book ends, it's in a way the return to what she's been saying all along to the daughters of Jerusalem. Don't arouse or awaken love until it pleases. Be careful. Wait. It's the older community of the brothers joining her voice in a chorus of saying, you be careful about who you set your affections upon. Bridget Fitassi is a woman that wrote a blog based on in her response to a book that I quoted liberally to you a few weeks ago called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, written by Louise Perry. It's a short book I highly recommend, not from a Christian worldview, but it's amazing how as she sifts through the damage of the sexual revolution, she finds herself with our answers because they're the right ones. And yet Bridget Fitassi read that book and wrote a blog. I won't read her whole blog, but it bears reading in full. Again, not a Christian to my knowledge. But she writes, upon opening Louise Perry's new book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, I moved to tears by the dedication. Quote, for the women who learned it the hard way. Unlike many other people who have read and reviewed Perry's work, reading her book wouldn't be some academic exercise in contemplating how liberal feminism has let women down. It wouldn't be evaluating what those poor sluts over there have endured in the wake of the sexual revolution. Reading her book was personal. I am one of those sluts. I am a case study for her thesis, a cautionary tale. And there's more to say, and it's worth reading, but to skip ahead. She says, if I'm honest with myself, of the dozens of men I've been with, at least the ones I can remember, I can only think of a handful I don't regret. The rest I would put in the category of, quote, casual, which I would define as sex that is either meaningless or mediocre or both. And if I get really honest with myself, I'd say most of these usually drunken encounters left me feeling empty and demoralized and worthless. I wouldn't have said it at the time, though. At the time, I would have told you I was, quote, liberated, even while I tried to drink away the sick feelings of rejection when my most recent hookup didn't call me back. At the time, I would have said one-night stands made me feel emboldened, but in reality, I was using sex like a drug, trying to unsuccessfully fill a hole inside of me. And she goes on, and it's tragic, and you can actually watch her read it. She says later, as someone who wrote an article for Playboy, she would write for Playboy. She said, I'm not supposed to talk like this. But she says, but I've realized this lifestyle, there's no life here. And particularly, you can watch her read the article on YouTube, breaks out into tears as she holds up a picture of herself and says, what would I say to that young girl, a picture of her as a child? What do I want for that young girl? And as she starts to speak about what she wants for that young girl in love, it sounds a whole lot like this. And that's what I want for you. Not an oppressive, Victorian binding of your sexual life because sex is bad. I think we've learned in this book, sex is a gift to be enjoyed within boundaries where you're safe. That's how God's designed it. That's someone who wants all of you, and you flourish in love together. That's what you fight for. That's what you wait for. And that's what they commend to this young woman. And here at the end, the woman speaks about her own experience, and she says, I was a wall. She said, I kept my standards high, and my breasts were like towers, meaning I grew up, and she uses this military metaphor. But she says, then I was in his eyes as one who finds peace. And that's an interesting line. It's a little confusing. She says, when I was a young woman, I was a wall. And then I began to grow and develop, And then I was in his eyes as one who found peace. And there's a play on words there, because peace there means wholeness and flourishing, but it's the word shalom. It's a derivation of it is the word Solomon. And so she's saying here, I waited, and then before his eyes, I was as one who found Solomon. She said, in the right time, in the right way, we found each other. And then in verse 11, it says, Solomon had a vineyard in Baal-Hamon. He owned a vineyard. He let out the vineyard to keepers. Each one was to bring for its fruit 1,000 pieces of silver. My vineyard, my very own, is before me. You, O Solomon, may have the 1,000, and the keeper of the fruit 200. Now, there's a lot of mystery around this language, but for the sake of time, let me say quickly what I think is happening here is, do you remember early on when they were attracted to each other? She said, my brothers made me work in a vineyard, and I had to work outside, and I wasn't able to keep my skin. She said, I didn't get to do the skincare I wanted. I was in the sun a lot. It burned me, but then she turns a corner and says, I am dark, but I am lovely, right? And now here at the end, when it comes all the way around, she says, my brothers and I worked in a vineyard, and the owner was Solomon. And so I waited, I worked, I was faithful, I did what was right. And in the midst of that, then in the right time, I was in the eyes of one who found peace. That I decided I'm going to walk with the Lord. I'm going to walk faithfully. I'm going to do what he's called me to do. I'm going to run in the paths of righteousness because he set my heart free. And in the right time, in the right way, God brought Solomon to me. And he speaks at the end, O you who dwell in the gardens with companions listening for your voice, let me hear it. The idea there is she's telling this story to the young ones, giving them hope that in due time, God does bring people together, even in a difficult day. And it's almost like, he's like, you done yet? Can we wrap this up? And she says, make haste, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or a young stag on the mountains of spice, which if you recall, is a lot of fun. Now, let me close with this. There's a lot to say around this, and it's interesting to talk about a subject like this. Why even do the Song of Solomon? I have felt the danger of talking about romantic love with you because it's in a crowd like this, it's like putting your hands on a wound, and you don't want to irritate it. You want to try to heal it, but you don't heal a wound by ignoring it. And for many of us, we long for love, and yet many of us have the wound of too much of our affections placed in the wrong place, or giving away things we wish we hadn't given away. And a lot of us, when we talk about this, we want to feel the springtime of the vineyard growing, but what we look around is we feel like we're in a vineyard of ash and ruin. And is there any hope? And I just want to turn around and say, as we talked about love, what it's like, that love is stronger than death, that love will grab you and never let go, that it will bind itself to you in covenant and endure through all things. You have that love today. That's what Jesus did. Jesus came for his beloved. Even when we weren't worthy, that didn't stop him. When we were in sickness, when we were on our way to death, when we were in poverty, he came to us. He was gentle, he was loving, and when death came for us, he stood in its way. And he took on death. He took on shame. He took on the grave. He took on hell. And he was buried in that grave, and grave could not stop love. And he burst forth, conquering death, and holds out his hands to you as the beloved. And he says, you are dearly loved. And he knows who you are. He knows what you've done. He knows how imperfect we've all been. And he chooses us still. And he chooses us again. And his love is so powerful, it can make us holy. And it can bind us in covenant with God's family forever. This human love is meant to be a picture of godly love. And where human love may have failed, his love does not. And so I want to tell you, yes, there are things we are meant to do and not do as people trying to figure out how to honor, respect, and love each other. But whether you've made a mess of all that and don't know the path forward or not, let me tell you today, you have a God who wants a covenant with you, who came racing across the desert like a column of smoke to get you, who binds himself with covenant with you and will not let you go. You get that relationship with God right through the bridegroom, Jesus Christ. And then together as his bride, we'll walk and we'll learn even in a crooked day how to hold up a righteous and true and beautiful love. That's the opportunity before us. The people of Jesus get to model the love of Jesus to a world that desperately wants a love that lasts. But let's start with him.